"I was mad at him for a long time," James Gibson said. "I didn't want to talk to him," Keith Smith admitted. Both men, now in their 50s, grew up on the same block in Chicago, across the street, just 3 houses apart. What happened between them would tear their lives apart for decades. In 1989, they were just 2 young men in their 20s from the south side of Chicago. They shared the same cracked sidewalks, the same corner stores, the same streets patrolled by police who didn't always see their community as one worth protecting. But that winter, the cold, gray December of 1989, would change everything. A double murder in their neighborhood set off a chain reaction of police pressure, public fear, and a desperate need to find someone to blame. When it was all over, both Gibson and Smith would be accused of a crime they didn't commit. Both would be tortured by officers who were part of a notorious group of detectives under the command of Chicago Police Commander Jon Burge, a name that would become infamous in the years that followed. And both would spend decades behind bars before the truth finally came to light. It started with 2 men, both found shot dead in their Chicago neighborhood. The city was tense. Gang violence was rising, and political pressure on the Chicago Police Department was intense. They needed answers. They needed arrests, and fast. James Gibson was at the wrong place at the wrong time, not at the crime scene, but on the radar of the police. He had a prior run-in with law enforcement. He was known in the area, and that was enough. Police picked him up, even though he told them he was running an errand across the neighborhood at the time of the killings. The station, Gibson expected a few questions. Instead, they handcuffed him to a chair. He was kept there for days. No lawyer. No phone call. No food that he could remember. Only fists, slaps, and boots, he said later. They punched me, slapped me, and kicked me. I blacked out at least once while in custody. Meanwhile, on the other side of the precinct, Keith Smith was going through the same thing. He was also handcuffed. Also beaten. Also isolated. At some point, the pain, exhaustion, and confusion became unbearable. "I'm gonna lie, so they could probably let me go," Smith recalled. He decided to tell the detectives what they wanted to hear. They told him Gibson had already confessed, that Gibson had put the blame on him. It wasn't true. But Smith didn't know that, so he gave them a statement. A false one. He signed a piece of paper he didn't write, claiming he had acted as a lookout while Gibson committed the murders. But it didn't help. Smith wasn't released. Instead, both he and Gibson were charged with double murder. What neither man knew at the time was that the detectives beating confessions out of them had done it before, and would do it again. For decades, Chicago Police Commander Jon Burge's name was whispered through the South Side. Burge had built his reputation as a hard man who got results, the kind of officer who could make a confession when no one else could. He led a group of detectives known as the Midnight Crew. Their methods weren't in the training manuals. They shocked suspects with electric devices. They suffocated them with typewriter covers. They burned them. They beat them. Between 1972 and 1991, at least 130 people, almost all of them black men, were tortured by Burge and his detectives. Gibson and Smith were 2 of them. After Gibson's brutal interrogation, he was sent home for a short while. His family tried to hug him when he walked through the door, but he winced in pain. His sister saw the bruises and immediately called to file a complaint. The next morning, police cars surrounded the house. There were like 10 or 15 officers, Gibson recalled. They were right in the front yard. He didn't resist. My family being in the house, I didn't want to cause any disturbance. I just got up and they said, "Man, you're under arrest," and they took me up out of there. That would be the last time he'd see his home for almost 30 years. In 1990, James Gibson stood before a judge. It was a bench trial, no jury. "That's where I fucked up at," Gibson later said. He thought the truth would protect him. He thought innocence was enough. "I was never worried about anything. I was never scared about anything, 'cause I ain't do nothing," he said. How do you fight a case that doesn't exist? But the truth didn't matter. The prosecution had a confession from Smith. They had statements from Smith's sisters, who would later admit they had lied under pressure. And they had testimony from another man who claimed to have seen something, a man who was himself facing an armed robbery charge. It was enough. Gibson was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. So was Keith Smith. 2 men from the same block, both tortured into false confessions, now both condemned to spend their lives behind bars. Inside, they each believed the other had betrayed them, and for years, they wouldn't speak. Prison changes a man. James Gibson entered with fury in his heart. blamed Keith Smith. He blamed the system. He blamed everyone. Until one day, an episode of Perry Mason changed everything. Watching the fictional defense lawyer expose lies and corruption inspired Gibson. He decided to learn the law himself. He became what inmates call a jailhouse lawyer. He studied every motion, every appeal, every statute he could get his hands on. His mother was his strength. She told me I was coming home, and I believed that, he said. But in 2002, after 12 years behind bars, Gibson's mother passed away. She told me I've got to get some things out of my heart, he said later. I'm still working on that. Keith Smith's story was equally heavy. His parents also died while he was serving time, and every few years, he'd get a letter from Gibson. I would never respond, Smith said. You would feel like that too if you feel like somebody did you like that. 16 years went by before Smith finally opened one of Gibson's letters and decided to write back. He had been talking to another inmate, an older man who understood the law. Man, they fucked both of y'all, the inmate told him. Y'all both can go home from this shit. Those words lit a spark. In 2006, Smith filed what's called a successive post-conviction petition, based on new evidence from a special prosecutor's report. The report confirmed that Jon Burge's detectives had tortured dozens of suspects, including Smith and Gibson. It was horrifying, detailed, and undeniable. But it would still take years for justice to reach them. Keith Smith was the first to walk free. In 2012, 22 years after his arrest, he was released. He took what's called an Alford plea, a legal move where a defendant maintains innocence but acknowledges the evidence against them. For Smith, the deal meant freedom. My mama just died, my father just died, he said. You think I'm thinking about some money? Fuck some money, man. That's what I did. He walked out of prison with nothing but time to catch up on. James Gibson's road was longer. He applied to the newly created Torture Inquiry and Relief Commission, a body designed to review claims of torture by Burge's officers. If the commission found a claim credible, it would be sent back to court for review. In 2015, the commission agreed Gibson had been tortured. They sent his case back to the same court that had once sentenced him to life. 4 years later, in April 2019, all charges against him were dismissed. After nearly 3 decades, Gibson walked out of prison a free man. I didn't have any feelings, he said. I've been fighting so long, I'm still swinging. I've been punch drunk. The next year, he was granted a certificate of innocence. Freedom doesn't erase time. James Gibson still wakes up at 3 in the morning, drenched in sweat. I sweat in the middle of the night, every night, he said. I had to plug my ears up and nose up with toilet paper, 'cause roaches were so deep in there. You can hear 'em, smell 'em. Keith Smith is still trying to rebuild. No transportation, no work consistently, he said. What I would like is that, and to be able to have a place to go home. But he smiles when he says this. I got what I really want, and that's freedom. To just get up and come outside. Gibson, meanwhile, took his case to civil court. He sued the city of Chicago. In June 2023, the city council approved a $14.75 million settlement. When the decision was announced, it was raining. Every time I get a blessing, it rains. It will be my mama, Gibson said. Outside the council chambers, he looked up to the sky and whispered, I'm here, mama. I made it. They couldn't break me. One of the first people to embrace him was Keith Smith. The two men, once torn apart by false confessions and years of anger, stood side by side again. But their lives couldn't be more different. Gibson had millions, a public vindication, and an official certificate of innocence. Smith had none of those things. Because of his Alford plea, he didn't qualify for a certificate of innocence, and without it, he couldn't file a civil suit. Once you do that, you have no remedy, said Gibson's attorney. Andrew Stroth. Smith doesn't regret it. He just wanted out. If my mother would have still been alive, I'd have taken an Alford plea too, Gibson admitted. Just to spend one moment with my mother. More than 30 years after that December night in 1989, the scars remain. 2 boys from the same block, tortured, convicted, broken apart, now living with the fragments of what's left. Gibson says even with the money, there's no celebration. It ain't no congratulations, he said. I had my whole life ahead of me. Standing outside his old home, he looked into the rain and said quietly, we take so much for granted out here in the world, man. Then he paused. That's the rain. Clearing up and washing up all this other mess. he said. "She's sending me a signal, saying, 'Now are you satisfied?'" Smith is still trying to find peace. "I can't get back those 20-something years," he said. "I've got to enjoy what's left, and that's how I look at the road ahead." Their stories will forever be bound by what happened in that interrogation room, and by the fight that followed. Fight not just for their freedom, but for the truth. Because in Chicago, the shadow of Jon Burge's torture ring still lingers, a stain on the city's justice system that time has not erased. For James Gibson and Keith Smith, justice came late. But it came, and in their voices, steady, scarred, but unbroken, you can still hear the same quiet truth: they survived. Freedom doesn't fix what was broken. For James Gibson and Keith Smith, release wasn't the end of the story, it was the beginning of another kind of fight. The fight to rebuild. The fight to be believed. The fight to exist again in a world that had moved on without them. James Gibson would later say, "They freed my body, but my mind was still locked up." When he walked out of prison in 2019, the world looked nothing like the one he'd left in 1990. Cell phones. The internet. Cars that didn't even need keys. He stepped into a world that had advanced, while he had stood still. His sister was gone. His mother, the woman who told him he'd come home one day, had died 17 years earlier. He didn't even know how to use a phone. "I didn't know how to swipe," he laughed in one interview. "I thought I broke it." Then, he stopped smiling. "I am 30 years old, man." To understand what happened to Gibson and Smith, you have to understand Jon Burge. Born in 1947, Burge was a Chicago cop who rose through the ranks after serving in the Vietnam War. He was decorated. He was respected. He was feared. But he brought the battlefield home. During the Vietnam War, Burge had reportedly learned torture tactics, using electrical devices on prisoners to make them talk. Back in Chicago, he put those same methods to work in police stations. From 1972 to 1991, his Midnight Crew operated unchecked. They beat men until they confessed. They electrocuted them with hand-cranked generators. They suffocated them with typewriter covers and plastic bags. And for years, the city looked the other way. Complaints were filed. Medical records showed injuries consistent with torture. But Burge's unit was considered effective. They solved murders fast. They got confessions faster. By the time internal investigators caught on, the damage was done. At least 130 people, almost all black men, had been tortured under his command. Gibson and Smith were two names in a long list that stretched across decades. Burge was finally fired in 1993, after being accused of brutalizing a suspect named Andrew Wilson. But he was never criminally charged for torture itself. By the time prosecutors built a case, the statute of limitations had expired. He was convicted only of perjury, for lying under oath about the abuse, in 2010. He served 4.5 years in federal prison. 4.5 years. Less time than many of his victims spent in solitary confinement. He died in 2018, at 70 years old, living quietly in Florida. In 2009, Illinois created something that had never existed before: the Torture Inquiry and Relief Commission. Its purpose was simple: to investigate claims of torture under Burge and his detectives. But its work was anything but simple. Hundreds of petitions poured in from inmates. Each one claimed the same thing: "I was beaten. I was shocked. I was forced to confess." Some cases had no physical evidence left. Others were missing files, missing witnesses, missing everything but pain. When Gibson filed his claim, even the commissioners were skeptical. The system had seen so many pleas for freedom, some real, some false, that it took time for the truth to break through. But Gibson had records. He had testimony. He had scars. 5 of the commission's members voted to send his case to court. That decision would change his life. It would take 4 more years before the court vacated his conviction. But when the day came, the same man who once walked into prison in handcuffs walked out in silence, blinking against the sunlight he hadn't seen in 3 decades. Inside prison, days are measured by meals and counts. Outside, Time moves differently. Keith Smith found that out the hard way. He'd been free since 2012, 7 years before Gibson, but life wasn't easy. He had no savings, no support, no place to live. He bounced between temporary housing and shelters. He looked for work, but employers weren't lining up to hire a man with a murder conviction, even one who'd been wrongfully accused. The system that stole his life didn't have much to offer when it gave it back. "I got freedom, but freedom doesn't pay bills," he said. He walked the same block he'd grown up on, the same cracked sidewalks, the same corner store, the same bus stop. Everything was familiar, and everything was different. Some of the same cops who'd arrested him were now retired. Some were dead. The houses had changed, but the faces of the young men on the corners looked the same. Sometimes he'd stop and watch them. "I see myself in them," he said quietly. "I see how easy it is for them to get caught up." He wasn't talking about crime. He was talking about the system. For Gibson, freedom wasn't enough. He wanted acknowledgement. He wanted the city to admit what had been done. In 2020, he filed a civil lawsuit against the city of Chicago. He didn't ask for sympathy. He asked for accountability. His lawyers argued that Gibson's conviction was the direct result of torture, perjury, and fabricated evidence. The case dragged on for years. Depositions, filings, motions. The city resisted. Until June 2023. The Chicago City Council voted to settle James Gibson's case for $14.75 million. The number made headlines. But for Gibson, it wasn't about money. "Every time I get a blessing, it rains," he said that day. "That's my mama." After the vote, he stepped outside, lifted his face to the sky, and whispered, "I'm here, Mama. I made it." After the settlement, Gibson and Smith met again, for the first time in years. Smith had come to celebrate his old friend's freedom and vindication. He was proud of him, but it was bittersweet. Because of the Alford plea Smith had taken to get out of prison, he couldn't file a civil suit. He had no legal path to compensation. "Once you take that plea," Gibson's attorney said, "you have no remedy." Smith didn't regret it. "My mama had just died," he said. "My father just died. You think I'm thinking about some money?" He paused. "Fuck some money, man." Still, the contrast was painful. Gibson had millions. Smith had freedom, and little else. But there was no resentment left between them. If anything, they understood each other more than ever. "If my mother was still alive, I'd have done the same thing," Gibson said. Their bond, once shattered by lies and police manipulation, was whole again. The city of Chicago has paid out more than $130 million in settlements and legal fees connected to the Burge torture cases. But no amount of money can undo what was done. Generations of families were destroyed. Children grew up without fathers. Mothers died waiting for their sons to come home. And the officers who carried out the torture, many of them kept their pensions. Even Burge. Until his death in 2018, he collected a $4,000 a month police pension. The same city that paid his victims was still paying him. When news of his death broke, Gibson was asked for a comment. He said only this: "I don't celebrate anybody dying. I just wish he'd lived long enough to tell the truth." It's been years since Gibson walked free, but he says the nights are still the hardest. "I close my eyes and I'm back there," he said. "Back in that cell, back hearing those roaches crawl." He sleeps with the lights on. He still flinches when someone knocks on the door too hard. He goes to therapy now. Part of his settlement includes lifetime access to counseling, but the process is slow. "After 30 years of fighting, you don't know how to rest," he said. Smith's healing looks different. He spends his time talking to young men in his neighborhood, warning them about the system, about choices, about survival. He's not an activist. He doesn't call himself a mentor. He just tells his story. "Some of them don't believe me," he laughs. "They think I'm lying. I tell them, go look me up." They do. And when they see his name in the old headlines, their laughter stops. In 2015, the city of Chicago made history. It became the first city in the United States to pass a reparations ordinance for victims of police torture. It included financial compensation up to $100,000 for survivors, free tuition at city colleges for them and their families, counseling and psychological services, a public memorial to acknowledge what happened. It was a landmark move, but for many, it came too late. Dozens of victims had already died before the ordinance was signed. Others, like Gibson, were still fighting through the courts. But it marked a shift, a public acknowledgement that what happened under Jon Burge wasn't just a few bad cops. It was a system that weaponized pain and called it justice. Freedom can be heavy. For men like James Gibson and Keith Smith, it comes with a question that never really goes away. What would my life have been if not for that night in 1989? If not for that precinct? If not for the lies? Smith said once, "I should be a grandfather now. I should have a family. But I got time instead." Gibson echoed him, "I had my whole life ahead of me." They're both trying to build something new, out of the ashes of what they lost. For Gibson, that means advocacy. He now works with legal reform organizations to support wrongfully convicted inmates. For Smith, it means something simpler. He just wants stability, a place to live, a reason to wake up without looking over his shoulder. Their story is not just about torture. It's about what happens when truth is buried beneath power, when a confession means more than evidence, when justice becomes negotiation. The Gibson and Smith case isn't an isolated tragedy, it's a warning, a reminder that systems fail when people stop asking questions, and that sometimes the only thing stronger than corruption is persistence. More than 30 years after two innocent men were beaten into false confessions, Chicago is still paying the price. But no dollar amount, no settlement, no ordinance can return what was stolen: youth, family, time. When asked what justice feels like, Gibson paused for a long moment. Finally, he said, "It's like breathing after holding your breath for 30 years." Smith was asked the same question. He smiled softly. "Justice," he said, "that's just being able to walk outside and not look back."